Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, but I can't vouch for how long I might be here. Boy, it was tough to connect. Apparently, YouTube is saying that there's 4 times the normal amount of live traffic, and they're having a hard time coping with it. This is the longest it took me to ever get on. Normally, I link to the chat 10 minutes in advance. Couldn't even do that. So, anyway, once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your Viceroy of Verisimilitude, your Sommelier of Cinema, your Master of Fun and Wonder, your Archbishop of Banterbury, and of course, ladies and gentlemen, as we all know, your existential Mr. Rogers, Robert Meyer Burnett, coming at you from the Robservatory, Robcasting at you from a very hot Robservatory, but I got the computer cooled down. It's a scorcher out there in LA today, about 100 degrees. By God, what a hot day it is. And this is Robservations episode number 408. And I am Robcasting you from the Robservatory to you, you imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. And it's great to be here with you. A little late today, and we will be on later tonight. Elizabeth and I will be on whining about the movies, talking about Tobe Hooper's 1985 seminal film that all of you know and love, Life Force. And we'll be talking about the international version, not the version that was introduced today. And how do you know the difference? Well, because John Larroquette narrates the opening of the international version. John Larroquette, he also narrated the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for Tobe Hooper, so they reteamed a decade later and did some more narration. I don't believe that narration appears on the regular standard version of Life Force. You also can tell because the beginning, the music is playing over an asteroid as we are revealed in space, and the opening is much longer when they go into the coma of Halley's Comet. So there you go. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight on Whining About the Movies. Well, ladies and gentlemen, right off the bat, let's talk about Bill Shatner. Come on. You better be clapping right now. You better be cheering. I want to hear whistles. I'm just going to assume you're going to give them to me. So as many of you know, there was a cosplayer up in Canada celebrating the 4th, May the 4th. A sweet girl dressed as a stormtrooper carrying her, I guess, Imperial-issued blaster. She got taken out by the cops. Apparently, as I do, they must think that real Star Wars Day should take place on May 25th, and they just think May the 4th is a bunch of hooey. But anyway, it's caused a lot of ire up there in the Great White North, and our boy William Shatner, our man, the myth, the legend in Heat Vision, today dropped 6 this morning. William Shatner criticizes police who drew guns on a cosplayer. This cannot be covered up, says Bill. The police chief has called for an investigation into whether the officers acted appropriately within the scope of policies and procedures. Look, man, when you're taking down a stormtrooper, they can't hit you anyway. How much of a threat are they going to be? Come on. William Shatner on Wednesday shared his contempt over a recent incident in Alberta, Canada, where police drew their guns on a woman who was dressed as a stormtrooper from Star Wars carrying a toy blaster. The incident made international headlines after a viral video of the situation was posted to social media showing guns drawn on the woman before she was taken to the ground by officers and bloodied. The woman was dressed as the sci-fi character, a generic sci-fi character, generic stormtrooper, was dressed as a sci-fi character for a business promotion for May the 4th, a.k.a. Star Wars Day. Come on, officers. Do you really think that an Imperial Stormtrooper, and by the way, she was a little short for a Stormtrooper. Shatner, a native Canadian who usually gives Star Wars fans a jokingly hard time on social media since he is a Star Trek icon, blasted the officers for their actions. Captain's log, Stardate 49, sending my contempt this morning to the Left Police of Alberta, Canada, and LPS Chief 1. Rifles drawn for a plastic toy cosplayer. Didn't comply right away. Are you blind, Chief? Watch the video to see how quickly she complied. This cannot be covered up, Shatner wrote to his more than 2.5 million followers. One Twitter user responded that the woman should not have been carrying the toy blaster, to which Shatner said, "Oh, please, did you see the gun? Also, when she's on her knees and the officer has his rifle ready to shoot, he's a mere feet from the gun. If he couldn't see it was a toy, he should retire." Yet they continued and slammed her to the ground and bloodied her nose. I want to know what happened to that Stormtrooper armor she was wearing. Hopefully nothing happened to that. According to local reports, the police chief has called for an investigation into whether the officers acted appropriately within the scope of policies and procedures. Last month, the gunman in Nova Scotia killed 22 people and injured others in the deadliest rampage in Canadian history. On Friday, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a ban on the use and trade of assault-style weapons. Here is, look at this. In this article, it's William Shatner there, and Xevious is right underneath him, right? You know who Xevious is, ladies and gentlemen? Right underneath Bill Shatner, Xevious is the man who did this drawing. So basically what I'm trying to say is it doesn't get more awesome than this right here. Xevious and Bill Shatner. Incredible. Wow. Look, I understand what happened in Canada was a horrible tragedy. What happened in Nova Scotia was a horrible tragedy, and people are probably on edge. And I understand why some people might act in an overzealous manner. This is not something that is surprising to me. However, come on, man. It's a stormtrooper. Clearly, it was a girl in that stormtrooper armor. Why don't you ask her to take her helmet off first? I mean, a stormtrooper does carry around a blaster. She's clearly in costume. It's not like how many people are in Alberta dressed as stormtroopers. Oh, maybe on May the 4th, quite a few. I don't know, but I would think that the officers, rather than go in guns a-blazing, well, not a-blazing, but they might, exercise some kind of restraint. Anyway, I just love that Bill Shatner came out in defense of this cosplayer. Once again, another reason to love William Shatner, because he is, in fact, one of the most awesome men to have ever lived. And Willow Yang should be proud that he is one of her countrymen. I know she is, if she's even here. I don't know if she is or not. Maybe she is. Anyway, to be honest, there's a lack of entertainment news. And I think a lot of people have noticed it. Certainly, the viewership on this channel has gone down a great deal because there's not a lot to talk about, and I get it. So I'm still, still here trying to keep the show going. The show must go on, right? So I'm always looking for interesting stories. I'm not going to go back and review like movies that came out in the 80s. Not that I see anything wrong with that, but I'd rather, here's a chance to get a little highbrow. Not that I don't try and get highbrow with you every day, but I figured, okay, I always go back to storytelling. Storytelling, what are stories? Why are stories? Everybody has a story to tell. All you have to do is listen. I really believe that. So I always find myself going back to stories. And it was funny. I was looking for coronavirus stories, people sheltering at home, and I stumbled across this Wired article. Now, for those of you who know me, you know that I love Wired. I've been reading Wired since the early 90s. I'm a huge fan of that magazine, and it's mostly gone online. There's still a print version of it. It's much smaller these days, but it's still coming out. But I really love Wired, and I stumbled across a story from March 8th, 2011. 9 years ago. A little over 9 years ago now. That was in Wired magazine. And I figured, wow, I started reading it, and I figured I'm going to share this on the show with everyone, with my Post-Geek Singularity community, because I thought it was cool. And here it is, The Art of Immersion. Oops. Why do we tell stories? Of course, if I could maybe perhaps get it back to where you could see it, you could see it. Why do we tell stories? And let's see if it doesn't really have I don't know how, it doesn't have an author's name here. I'm sure we'll find it as we go. What is it about stories anyway? Anthropologists tell us that storytelling is central to human existence, that it's common to every known culture, that it involves a symbiotic exchange between teller and listener, an exchange we learn to negotiate in infancy. Just as the brain detects patterns in the visual forms of nature, a face, a figure, a flower, and in sound, so too it detects patterns in information. Stories are recognizable patterns, and in those patterns we find meaning. We use stories to make sense of our world and to share that understanding with others. They are the signal within the noise. So powerful is our impulse to detect story patterns that we see them even when they're not there. In a landmark 1944 study, 34 humans, Massachusetts college students actually, though subsequent research suggests they could have been just about anyone, were shown a short film and asked what was happening in it. The film showed two triangles and a circle moving across a two-dimensional surface. The only other object on screen was a stationary rectangle, partially open on one side. Only one of the test subjects saw this scene for what it was: geometric shapes moving across a plane. Everyone else came up with elaborate narratives to explain what the movements were about. Typically, the participants viewed the triangles as two men fighting, and the circle as a woman trying to escape the bigger, bullying triangle. Instead of registering inanimate shapes, they imagined humans with vivid inner lives. The circle was worried. The circle and the little triangle were innocent young things. The big triangle was blinded by rage and frustration. But as stories themselves are universal, the way we tell them changes with the technology at hand. Every new medium has given rise to a new form of narrative. In Europe, the invention of the printing press and movable type around 1450 led to the emergence of periodicals and the novel. The invention of the motion picture camera around 1890 set off an era of feverish experimentation that led to the development of feature films by 1910. Television, invented around 1925, gave rise a quarter century later to I Love Lucy, and the highly stylized form of comedy that became known as the sitcom. If you are great fans of this particular show, you might remember that I've shared this article before. That's just another story. Each of these media achieved production and distribution on an industrial scale. We saw the emergence of 20th century mass media, newspapers, magazines, movies, music, TV. And with that, there was no role left for the consumer except to consume. Then, just as we gotten used to consuming sequential narratives in a carefully prescribed point-by-point fashion, came the internet. The internet is the first medium that can act like all media. It can be text or audio or video or all the above. It's non-linear thanks to the World Wide Web and the revolutionary convention of hyperlinking. It's inherently participatory, not just interactive in the sense that it responds to your commands, but an instigator instantly encouraging you to comment, to contribute, to join in. And it is immersive, meaning that you can use it to drill down as deeply as you'd like about anything you want to know about. So powerful is our impulse to detect story patterns that we see them even when they're not there. At first, like film and television in their earliest days, the internet served mainly as a way of retransmitting familiar formats. For all the talk of new media, it functioned as little more than a new delivery mechanism for old media. Newspapers, magazines, music, the emergence of P2P, point-to-point, file-sharing networks encouraged a lot of people to get their deliveries for free. But as disruptive as the net has been to media businesses, it's now only having an impact on media forms. Now, keep in mind, this is an article from 9 years ago. Under its influence, a new type of narrative is emerging, one that's told through many media at once in a way that's nonlinear, participatory, and above all, immersive. This is deep media. Stories that take you deeper than an hour-long TV drama or a 2-hour movie or a 30-second spot will permit. The most talked about ad campaign of the past year involved a former football player who took questions about Old Spice on Twitter for 2 days and responded to the best of them minutes later on YouTube. Nike, a web service that doubles as a marketing platform, or Nike Plus, functions as a branded corner of cyberspace where runners can keep their stats and tell their own stories. Tron Legacy was preceded by Flynn Lives, an alternate reality game that engaged millions of people worldwide in the 18 months before the movie came out. And the 2010 season of the BBC's Doctor Who was made up of 13 television episodes and 4 that came in the form of downloadable video games. Lost told a story so convoluted that the audience had little choice but to work together to decipher it communally online. Even then, it didn't make sense in the end. An artistic achievement, albeit an organic and as yet untested one, is forming. David Shields writes in Reality Hunger, a Manifesto, a book whose truth... Sorry, I must dab my brow. It's so hot. A book whose truth to its time underscored by the gleeful way it samples from other sources. What are its key components? Shields names several: randomness, spontaneity, and emotional urgency, reader-viewer participation and involvement, anthropological autobiography, a thirst for authenticity coupled with a love of artifice, a blurring to the point of invisibility of any distinction between fiction and nonfiction, the lure and blur of the real. We stand now at the intersection of lure and blur. The future beckons, but we're only partway through inventing it. We can see the outlines of a new art form, but its grammar is as tenuous and elusive as the grammar of cinema a century ago. We know this much. People want to be immersed. They want to get involved in a story, to carve out a role for themselves, to make it their own. But how is the author supposed to accommodate them? What if the audience runs away with the story? And how do we handle the blur? Not just between fact and fiction, but between author and audience. Entertainment and advertising. Story and game. A lot of smart people in film and television and video games and advertising and technology, even in neuroscience, are trying to sort these questions out. The art of immersion is their story. And then this goes on. Why do we tell stories? And, I already passed that. And then I wanted to do this. I meant to go to the Star Wars generation, since, hey, it is what I like to call Revenge of the Sixth. Adam Horowitz blames the whole thing on Star Wars. Horowitz, who with his writing partner, Edie Katsis, was an executive producer on Lost and a screenwriter for Tron Legacy, remembers seeing Star Wars in Times Square with his mom when he was 5. As soon as it was over, he wanted to go right back in. There's no bigger Star Wars geek than Damon Lindelof, he admits. Lindelof, the co-creator of Lost with J.J. Abrams, was only 4 when he saw the picture. Now keep in mind, when this article was written, there was no Force Awakens, there was no thought that there was going to be a sequel trilogy, and Disney hadn't even bought Star Wars at the time of this article. Lindelof, the co-creator of Lost with J.J. Abrams, was only 4 when he saw the picture. Years later, when ABC's Lloyd Braun paired him with Abrams as the show was in development, Lindelof showed up for their first meeting wearing an original Star Wars t-shirt he'd gotten when he and his dad joined the Star Wars fan club. Abrams was wowed. Lindelof, Abrams, Joss Whedon, creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Firefly, for a whole generation of Hollywood writers in the 30s and 40s, Horowitz quips, Star Wars was a gateway drug. It was also a precursor to what we're coming to expect in movies and TV. Shows in the past, Lindelof points out, went to great lengths to avoid unanswered questions. Lost was deliberately ambiguous, because they didn't know the answers to those questions. The show became an excuse to develop a community online, says Carlton Cuse, who headed the production with Lindelof, and the basis of it was that people were able to debate open-ended questions that we insisted be open-ended and that would get fans engaged in the show. Years before the web, with its boundless connectivity and endless cascade of hyperlinks turned entertainment into a spelunking expedition, Star Wars was a saga you could immerse yourself in at will. But it wasn't actually meant to be that. In the mid-'70s, when the original picture was released, it didn't occur to anyone to create a deep media universe for fans to dive into. Star Wars was accompanied by a cascade of merchandise, but much of it had only a tenuous connection with the movie. The novel from Del Rey, purportedly written by Lucas himself, was in fact ghosted by science fiction writer whose only guide was an early draft of the script. That would be Alan Dean Foster. The Marvel Comics series began veering off in weird directions as early as Episode 8, when Han Solo and his Wookiee sidekick Chewbacca encountered Jackson, a giant rabbit the writers deemed as an homage to Bugs Bunny. And neither the fans nor George Lucas himself seemed to think this was odd. It was just the way things worked at the time. The difference between then and now, says Howard Rothman, the Lucasfilm executive in charge of what is now known as the Star Wars Expanded Universe, is that we didn't know what we had. Oh, well, I guess I can't find the rest of this article because it must be archived. Oh, there it is. Complex canon was the key. Lucas called it immaculate reality, which, by the way, as we know from yesterday's show, he got from Kurosawa. Digitally conceived, spun out of charged electrons, and yet with such a level of detail as to feel instantly familiar. Rothman was put in charge of licensing in 1986, 3 years after the last of the original trilogy came out. At that point, he puts it, you couldn't give the toys away, or the comics or anything else. Friends said he should start looking for another job, and instead he took it as an opportunity to introduce the concept of canonicity. The saga by this time had become a confused jumble. If it wasn't Marvel conjuring up giant bunnies, it was Luke Skywalker in the 1978 novel Splinter of the Mind's Eye getting affectionate with Princess Leia, who 5 years later in Return of the Jedi would turn out to be his twin sister. So Rothman set a new ground rule. From now on, any new installment in the Star Wars saga would have to respect what had come before. Another new ground rule was set by Lucas himself, said that Lucas didn't have to obey any of the rules. It just seemed the logical thing, Rothman says now. If you're going to tell stories beyond what you see in the films, the minute they contradict each other, your house falls apart. If you kill off a character, then try to revive him, it's going to be bogus. Of course, no one would have cared without quality inherent in Star Wars from the beginning. George created a very well-defined universe, Rothman says, a universe of fractal-like complexity, but the movies tell a narrow slice of the story. You can engage on a simplistic level, but if you want to drill down, it's infinitely deep. This complexity would be key. Lucas called it immaculate reality. Digitally conceived, spun out of charged electrons, and yet with such a level of detail, it would feel instantly familiar. Every single utensil in the kitchen of Owen and Beru Lars, the humble moisture farmers who sheltered young Luke Skywalker on the arid planet of Tatooine after his father became Darth Vader, Lord of the Sith, the fully realized interior of the Death Star, the moon-sized Imperial battle station armed with a super laser capable of destroying an entire planet. You could zoom in on any section of any frame and have 100 stories to tell, Rothman says, but it wasn't because George ever imagined anybody would zoom in like that. He just wanted to make it feel real. With Rothman's decree, Lucasfilm not only found the instrument that would help reinvigorate the Star Wars franchise, it also created the prototype for the kind of deep, multi-layered storytelling that's increasingly becoming the norm today. Star Wars references proliferated on Lost, but more significant are the similarities in the way stories like Lost and Star Wars are structured. To provide overwhelming amounts of information, but in a time-release fashion that creates maximum anticipation. Eddie Kitsis calls this the Boba Fett effect, after the bounty hunter, who has a passionate following among Star Wars fanatics, even though he had a minor role in the movies. You'd see these glimpses, he says. Boba Fett didn't even appear in the original movie, but not long after his initial TV appearance, he was made available as a toy. You had to send in 4 proofs of purchase. Then, in The Empire Strikes Back, he had 4 lines, but he made you think about bounty hunters. Lost owes a lot to that. This is the kind of thing that made Star Wars so influential. Star Wars wasn't just science fiction, says Kitsis. What was cool about it was a whole world. It was about a kid in a small town, Luke Skywalker on the podunk planet Tatooine, who longs for adventure. It tells you anybody can do anything, Horowitz adds. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are, and that's a very powerful message for a kid. Luke lives on a desert planet in the far reaches of the galaxy, and he becomes a hero of the universe. It's like Hollywood. If you believe in yourself, you can do it. I like this article. I read the first part of it once before, and I thought I would share it again. Because, it got me thinking, especially reading everybody's reactions to the finale of Clone Wars, which I still haven't seen, but I've certainly read a lot of the reactions, about how much stories mean to us, how much they define, how we're all of us, are the stars of our own tales. I mean, I was talking to somebody today online, and now the question has become, how's your quarantine going? I've heard that from everybody. Maybe it's an LA thing. How's your quarantine going? And I'm thinking, I never thought of it that way. Now I have my quarantine story to tell people. And that's strange from someone who's always saying every person you meet has a story to tell, but I wasn't thinking that my quarantine was much of a story. I think in the sense that I've been very productive during this quarantine season. I guess if you could call it that. Maybe we'll have quarantine seasons from now on as we have instant viral outbreaks every, couple of months. Who knows? We'll see where it's going. But my quarantine story has become one of productivity. Yesterday, I was working on the as of yet unannounced show on Netflix that I've been working on. I was working on episode 10, the second episode of the second season. Go figure. I was working on it via Zoom. Strange. With a number of the production staff. That's odd. I'd never done that before. Now I've done it multiple times. We finally got approval, or to be honest, director Dave Parker got approval for his Hills Run Red commercial that I may have dropped on this show before. Oops. But we had to make changes. We had to pull out the logos, or Dave had to make the changes. He had to pull out the logos from the beginning. So the version I saw to you, or showed you with those 3 logos, was like the director's cut. That's part of my quarantine story. And I've been doing these shows. I had my 400th episode. I was able to get JBL and Harmon to give me something to give away on this channel. A $1,000 piece of gear that isn't even available till May 31st. And speaking of which, why not give it a shameless plug right now, ladies and gentlemen? As you know, the Burnettwork is giving away, along with Robservations, to celebrate our 400th episode, this is JBL's Bar 9.1. This is a 10-channel Dolby Atmos soundbar with a subwoofer and satellite speakers. It sells for just shy of $1,000. It won't be available to the public until May 31st, and you can enter a sweepstakes. It's not a sweepstakes, I say that all the time. A giveaway for the channel that was made possible by Harmon's Experiential Engagement Division and Connie there. Connie's very nice, and she made this possible. I was able to organize this during quarantine, so I guess it's part of the quarantine story that I can now tell people. Up until today, I never really thought about having a quarantine story. And then once you think about that, everybody's got a quarantine story. What have you been doing for the last 2 months? Have you been productive? Have you been unproductive? I feel like I've gained 20 pounds drinking beer and eating pizza. Now I need to go outside and get svelte again. Not that I was ever very svelte. Well, I was about 10 years ago. I was ripped. I could do that again. Now I'm 10 years older. Anyway, we've all got quarantine stories to tell. So it's interesting to me that every day, every moment of every day, everybody's involved in telling their own story somehow. And I think that's kind of reassuring. That's kind of comforting. I like that idea. I like that we're making stories up as we go every moment of every day. And then the question is asked, well, you can't do any rewriting, so you got to do what you can to make your story as interesting as it can possibly be, which I think is kind of a good way to be, if you think about it. But anyway, those are my Robservations for the day. I don't know, take them as you will. Of course, I'll be back tonight to talk about Life Force, and I'll probably have something even more to say. But you know what's great? You know what I want to say about all you guys? I want to thank you because every single day, you guys are sending me letters with your stories in them. And I've been surprised. I thought that there would be a time when somehow that there would be that people would just stop. Nobody would write me letters anymore. But that hasn't been the case. And so let me fire up one of these letters and read them to you, because it's been amazing to hear from you guys every single day. Some of you I've heard from obviously more than others, including King Waspinator. King Waspinator's here, ladies and gentlemen. I know even King Waspinator sometimes thinks our stories, like our show on The Elephant Man, was anticlimactic. So I'm sorry about that, King Waspinator. Stop the presses, says King Waspinator. We have a crisis on our hands, one that threatens the safety and peace of mind of the American people. No, it's not the coronavirus or rising tensions with China or Iran or Venezuela, nor the impending doom of big tech's nefarious plots to use AI to more accurately target our social media accounts with insurance ads. No, in this, the year of our Lord, 2020, Anno Domini, the greatest threat we are faced with, Rob, is Orcs. Orcs. Oh, yeah. Good morning, it's your old pal, King yada yada yada. I get the impression that you are in need of content, so hopefully this will be of service. Don't worry, I'll tie this to Star Trek by the end. So anyway, orcs are racist. Or more accurately, orcs are themselves a racist stereotype. This is the claim that arises every now and then, that has been making the rounds across YouTube again over the last week. Seems some fresh-faced noob, upon reading the section on orcs in Volo's Guide to Monsters, took to social media to decry Dungeons & Dragons for giving orcs a description that the reader in question believed sounded an awful lot like old stereotypes about African Americans. Edgelord YouTube got wind of this and has been making video after video about how this is ridiculous. Orcs are fictional beings, and so on and so forth. And while I may agree with the notion that if someone sees orcs in fiction and immediately thinks black people, it says more about the reader than it necessarily does about the intent of the author. I would not so humbly disagree that there's no fire here from which smoke was spotted. Dungeons & Dragons, a game that largely defines the player characters by their race and class, is, by very definition, racist and classist. The trick to it is, there's a good reason for this, and there's good to be mined from telling these kinds of stories. This goes beyond Dungeons & Dragons, of course. This is really about the entire genre of fantasy fiction, and to some extent, science fiction as well. For the vast, vast bulk of history, something like 99% of it, humans lived in fairly self-isolated xenophobic groupings, which were rather alien to one another for a variety of reasons. Human storytelling traditions emerged from this sort of world, and now that we live in our modern context, attempts to tell stories set in that kind of environment would come across as rather blatantly racist. Just look at the portrayal of Persians in Zack Snyder's adaptation by 300, by way of example. But if you make a fictional setting with distinctly non-human races and species, you can tell the old tales of conflicting societies and the clash between civilization and barbarism without pointing fingers at any particular group's ancestry. In fact, it often allows for the portrayal of a much more modernized and cosmopolitan vision of humankind, while dumping our negative tendencies into allegorical beings such as elves, orcs, and what have you. And on top of that, specific to Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games, it often leads to the players having characters of different races, often with deep historical rivalries and grievances, learning to overcome them, and pool their talents to defeat even greater foes. In other words, whether or not it was intended, D&D sort of is low-key teaching its players about how to achieve racial harmony. So while it may, yes, indeed, be a game that is intrinsically about race, the overall point is a positive one, and should not be canceled to spare some rando on Twitter's personal sensitivities. The observation that fictional fantasy races and sci-fi aliens are often chock full of exaggerated characteristics of quote-unquote foreign people is hardly anything new. For at least a decade now, the internet has been full of snarky comments about George Lucas's apparently racist prequel trilogy. But was it? Was it really? Does Watto make George Lucas anti-Semitic? Or is the person who sees Watto and thinks this must be a flying space Jew the actual racist? It's an age-old debate, and one that I will certainly not resolve. Though I don't know exactly what science fiction writers are supposed to do here. Audiences need to be able to understand the stuff they're participating in by viewing, reading, playing, and with no actual sentient aliens out there to interact with, I'm not sure what human storytellers are expected to base alien societies upon. Being too realistic with aliens, if such a statement even makes sense, would very likely result in stories or characters that are too unrelatable to a casual audience, a small niche audience maybe, but not the mundane masses. And then there's the Star Trek angle. I have a coworker who is about 15 or so years younger than me, and over the last few years she's been delving into Star Trek, and we've had quite a few conversations about the various shows as she's discovered them. Right off the bat, despite being exactly the target audience Discovery was aiming to find, she found that particular series boring and had no interest in seeing Picard. She likes the old stuff. TNG in particular seems to be her favorite, but it was when she told me about watching DS9 for the first time that relates to the subject at hand. She described Major Kira as, quote, that racist lady, which took me a few minutes to even figure out who she was referring to. But sure, yeah, I guess by the standards of a modern 20-something, maybe Kira is racist. Many of the aliens in Star Trek are just as much based on vague real-world stereotypes as anything seen in Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or Forgotten Realms, but they serve an informative purpose. Star Trek uses its aliens to have its cake and eat it too. By shoving allegories about real-world bigotry into conflict onto the alien species, they can tell stories that address these issues while simultaneously depicting humans in an idealized light, something that Dungeons & Dragons can and does also do. So are orcs racist? Sure, depending on how you're framing it. Are orcs a stand-in for black people? No. Whoever said that is clearly an idiot, or some flavor, because orcs are obviously Irish. Until next time, stay waspinated. Well, King Waspinator, I want to say I like this letter a great deal. When it comes to storytelling, I find it interesting. I mean, obviously, I've read these stories. I mean, I remember reading analysis of King Kong, and that King Kong was racist. I've been hearing those things for a long time. And I think it's strange because at the end of the day, sometimes a kiss is just a kiss. A cigar is just a cigar. Now, that's not to say I've come across a lot of racist tropes. And when I was growing up, I always found it strange that people thought I actually met people that they didn't consider me a Jew. And I've met other Jews that don't because they say to me, well, you were adopted into a Jewish family. Of course, when I met my biological mother and found out she was a Jew, things changed. But it was strange. The only place that I ever went and thought people that were supposed to be Jewish didn't look like the Jews that I thought they were supposed to look like was Israel. Go figure. But the point is, you know, I always come back to, it just depends on where you're standing on the planet. I think given enough time, everybody's hated somebody at some point. I mean, can you imagine? Like I told the story about when I was in South Korea, everywhere I went, I was strange looking. I was tall. I'd walk into stores and people would either engage with me or they'd look at me with some kind of trepidation, like I was going to do something, or I was a loud American. Even the way we speak is different. Like when we go into a store, I'm like, oh my God, look at this. This is so cool. That, you know, I don't know what that says about me, but it's true. And the important thing is to understand that every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear, and all you have to do is listen. Because that's what makes us great, is that human beings can tell stories, and every human being has a story to tell. And the sooner we realize that, I think the better off we will be. I wish people would realize that if somebody looks different than you, if they're different nationality, if their skin pigmentation or their external characteristics are different than yours, those are the first people that are going to have stories to tell that you have yet to hear. Because they've probably been places or have experienced things that you haven't. So they're the first people you should listen to. At least that's the way I've always seen it. But still, stories. I'm telling you. Brian Eng writes in and says, hi, Rob. Since you were working in Hollywood in the mid-90s, do you have any insight onto the start of UPN other than Voyager and WB? Did you like any of their shows, such as Nowhere Man or The Sentinel on UPN? Well, it's really interesting, sir. Brian, I was working at a advertising agency called Jacobs and Gerber. And when I was there, they were doing all of the ads for the upcoming UPN launch. They had done Voyager ads and things like that, but they were doing all the UPN stuff. And I was there, and we were seeing all the shows. So I saw all of the UPN pilots. The only one I really liked, obviously I liked Voyager. I really thought Caretaker was a great pilot. But I really liked Nowhere Man. Again, I thought it had sort of an impossible prisoner-esque premise, and unfortunately it was canceled before its time. But it was really interesting watching the network, in a way, has the same problem. It had the same problem that streaming services have today. They had to fill up their broadcast window, and it wasn't going to be 24/7 to start with, but it was a network, and they had to make all these shows great, and they were, to me, they were all like variations on a theme. There wasn't something that was earth-shatteringly original, but it was really interesting participating in how do you launch a TV network that's basically showing familiar TV shows and make it sound different than the shows that are already on the air. I mean, even Star Trek was just another Star Trek show, but back then, Star Trek was probably at its zenith of popularity, 94, 95. That was peak Star Trek. I mean, Star Trek has never been more popular than when Next Generation went off the air, Generations was coming out, Deep Space Nine was on, and Voyager was launching with a female captain. I mean, it was huge. So, I mean, I did like Nowhere Man, but that was really the only show that really stuck out to me. None of the other shows really lasted that long, and neither did Nowhere Man, which is kind of a bummer. But it was interesting to see. I didn't have anything to do with WB. Although, working with Kevin Rubio, I used to cut promos for the kids' WB, and that was fun. Kevin and I had a lot of fun doing that. Christopher McCulloch sends in a letter and says, Mr. Burnett, your comment about British accents sounding smart is no accident. The British accent you're referring to is called received pronunciation, so called because it is how the upper classes of Britain are taught to speak when going to esteemed public schools. Historically, how someone spoke in English told you much about them, not just where they were from, but also what kind of education they received. The difference has been reflected in art for a long time as a shorthand for showing us which of our characters represent the elite and which the hoi polloi. Going as far back as Shakespeare, Julius Caesar's patricians speak in patrician speak in verse, and the plebeians speak in prose. And as in Shakespeare's time, so too in the language of film, in all of those historic epics, the toga-wearing elites speak in the king's English, and the non-Romans or commoner, well, they're probably American. Hello, Heston. I was happy to find that my favorite HBO miniseries, Rome, continued this tradition. Our protagonists, the plebeian soldiers, speak plainly. The non-Romans speak with foreign accents, while the political class speak in received pronunciation, except a cunning few or upwardly mobile who code switch depending on where or with whom they are speaking. But I know what you're asking. How will I make this about Star Wars? Well, look no further than Luke, Leia, and Tarkin. What we know about the galaxy is that it has a bright center, that the benighted Luke lives furthest from, and his speech reflects this. Army Brad Hamill has the perfect accent for someone who could be from anywhere. Not only is the Empire clearly technologically advanced, but we can infer the core worlds are also culturally advanced. How? Juxtaposed to Outer Rim Luke, Tarkin is the face of the Empire, and with him Peter Cushing's cultured locution, showing us the Empire is, or once was, cultured. We can also see this in Alec Guinness' equally trained diction, who looks back fondly on the Old Republic. These two characters are both representatives of the old world and what it has become. Leia, senator of the Empire and secret rebel, of course, code switches. People make fun of it sometimes, but it's clear Leia speaks to Vader and Tarkin differently than she speaks to Luke or Han, playing the role of senator and rebel to each. I've always thought that. I don't think I've ever heard it articulated before by anyone, though. But there you go. Nicely done, Chris. I could talk about foreign languages that have mechanically different modes of speech based on your relative social class, or how that can make what seems like a sparse amount of dialogue to non-speakers carry much more weight to those who understand it, possibly adding to the reputation foreign films have of being slow, but I'll leave that to the better equipped. I suppose bringing up language in class will invite some non-productive conversation, but I, for one, enjoy the layers it can add to a story. Christopher, Mid-Atlantic, I'm told. Devil if I know what that is. Well, Christopher, what a great letter you have written. Once again, you just never know what's going to fly in over the transom, and man, I'm getting some good letters from you people. You should all be damn proud. What a good letter. Here's another one. This comes, I can't read this one because this one is for our show tonight. This is a letter for, let me put it over here, for Elizaviews whining about movies. Yes, Elizaviews gets mail as well. Jen Katagiri says, "Hello, Robert. I believe I've heard you say once you would do coverage on a screenplay if it's paid. Is that still the case? And how much do you charge for coverage of a 120-page feature? Thank you." Well, Jen, I'll say Jen. I never really thought about that. I absolutely would, but if you would want somebody to do, you don't want just screenplay coverage. Coverage is just a synopsis, which you already know if you wrote the script, and then it's a recommendation, and what you want is a screenplay analysis, which is in depth. You're going to want to pay somebody to talk to you at length about your script, and I never really thought about that. The last time I did that, it was a long time ago when I sat down. I was paid to give somebody script analysis. I have to say right off the bat, I'm reluctant to do that. Not that I don't like money, and I wouldn't necessarily. I'd of course love to be paid. The problem that I have with doing that for other people, because I'm not used to doing it, is I want to be nice. And a lot of people, they don't really want criticism. They want affirmation. And I wouldn't want to burst anyone's bubble. But we can talk about it. I'll send you an email, and we can talk about it offline. But I would be reluctant, because people, oh man, it can get brutal. It can get brutal. I don't want to make anybody mad. Would you imagine that Omar94 wrote a letter and says, "Hi, Rob. I wanted to give 2 more recommendations for movies I really like that are underappreciated for everyone here. My first recommendation is Ridley Scott's Legend with Tom Cruise, Tim Curry, and Mia Sara. There are several cuts of the movie, but the director's cut is the one I'm recommending to everybody. The interesting thing about that is not only is the director's cut much longer, but the director's cut has a score by Jerry Goldsmith as opposed to the American version, which is like 94 minutes or something, and has a Tangerine Dream score. So the feel of the movies is very different. I, too, prefer the director's cut. However, I love the Brian Ferry song, Is Your Love Strong Enough? I love that song. And the John Anderson song. And I like the Tangerine Dream score, like when Mia Sara is dancing with darkness. I love that piece of music. My second recommendation is Young Sherlock Holmes, directed by Barry Levinson, of Rain Man, Bugsy, Wag the Dog, and Good Morning Vietnam fame, and written by Chris Columbus, screenwriter of The Goonies, as well as director of Home Alone 1 and 2, Mrs. Doubtfire, and Harry Potter 1 and 2. I can see a lot of Harry Potter 1 and 2 in this movie, since Columbus wrote it and went on to direct the first 2 Harry Potter films, as the story of this movie is about 3 kids, 2 boys, and a girl at a boarding school in England solving a supernatural mystery. Thanks, live long, and prosper. I'm a huge fan of both Legend and Young Sherlock Holmes. I don't want to piss off any Sherlock Holmes purists in the audience, but I really, really, really like Young Sherlock Holmes. I think it's a delightful movie, even though some people have always pointed out it has a lot of similarities to Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, but I won't elaborate on why. People have been sending in chats. Calvin Bowles is here with 3. Calvin says, why in the Godfather movies are there contradictions in time? In the first film, Tom Hagen says it's almost 1946, yet the comedy sex, that the killing of McCluskey was in 1947. Anthony is about 3 in the first film, and in Godfather 2, why are they having his first communion? I think they might play fast and loose with the time frame, but if you think about it, there is a lot of time covered in the movies. Definitely fast and loose. Oh, I see. Why are they having his first communion in 1959 when the first communion is 7 when they have a personal priest? Also in part 3, they say it's 1979 when Pope John Paul dies, but he died in 78. Pope John Paul II toured America in 79. Also, May and Anthony should be pushing 30. How could a talented guy like Coppola miss the inconsistencies? Well, I think it's not exactly analogous to our world. It was metaphorically that way. But that's interesting. You make me want to go back and watch those movies again just to see where the inconsistencies may be. I think there's a little bit of like how long did they go to the mattresses? How long was Michael in Italy in the first film? I don't know. Does the timeline check out when Vito came to America and then he ascended to become the head of the Corleone family? I don't know. I'd have to check. That's interesting. I'd like to go back. I'm sure online there's a Godfather timeline that will lay all of this out for you, and it'll make it all work. As a matter of fact, I think there's even a Godfather timeline on the actual Blu-rays. I'm just going to punch in the Godfather timeline and see what it comes up with. There it is, the Godfather timeline. And, of course, there's a Godfather timeline. Yeah, and you know what? I won't go through the whole thing, but I definitely will put it in the live chat for you guys. Here's the Godfather timeline, and it has everything laid out. And I'm giving it a cursory glance, but there you go. There is the Godfather timeline. Beginning with Vito Andolini Corleone is born in Corleone, Sicily in 1892. And Hyman Roth is also born. There you go. Wow, now I want to go back and look at this whole thing. Thanks for that. Willow sends in a tip and says, is there a difference between best movie and favorite movie to you? Oh, 100%. 100%. For instance, you say that the motion picture is your favorite Star Trek movie, but it is objectively the best Star Trek movie to you. No. I think that I can recognize when movies are great, just like I can recognize that a painting is great, but that doesn't necessarily make it my favorite. Star Trek the Motion Picture is far and away my favorite Star Trek film for a number of different reasons that I've talked about before. But a lot of which has to do with how the Star Trek universe is portrayed. And the actual story being told, to me, is far more intriguing and more meaningful than, say, Star Trek II, which reduces the character of Khan, Noonien Singh to a raving villain, which I understand. But Khan, I think, was a more three-dimensional character in the episode Space Seed, and what Star Trek II does is it reduces what's going on to a very traditional narrative structure, which is fine. I like this stuff about mortality and all that and friendship and everything. I think it's great. It did not inspire me. It did not tickle my sense of awe and wonder that Star Trek the Motion Picture does. And Star Trek always symbolized that to me. There's just a lot in it. I don't like the uniforms, the monster maroons. I think that, why are people wearing pea coats on the Enterprise? I mean, I get it. You want to give that nautical feel, but I don't think that everybody who's going to be wandering around a starship wants to feel like they're on the conning tower of a film, maybe the Red October in the North Atlantic. There are things about Star Trek II that always have bothered me from the first time I saw it. Now, I recognize that it's a rousing adventure yarn. It is a great tale, but it's not my favorite. And I think that's true of a lot of things. So I mean, I can recognize something's merits, but they don't have to be my favorite. And I think that's true of a lot of things. You know, if you like a band, like there are Duran Duran. I'll give you an example. Medazzaland is not a great Duran Duran record. It's not very good. I can recognize it's not very good, but I really like it. But compared to Duran Duran's oeuvre, it is certainly one of their lesser albums. You know, or Liberty. Not a great record, but there are songs on it that are personal favorites of mine. So I think it's a dichotomy. I think that you can recognize that something is good or bad, and it doesn't, you don't have to be afraid of liking something about it. Tough Turf is a favorite 80s teen film of mine. It's a favorite. Is it the best? Is it like a John Hughes movie? No. But it's a favorite of mine because of its goofiness. And I recognize that about me. I would never tell somebody, this movie's great. But it is a favorite. I think it's great, but I wouldn't try and impose anyone else's. I wouldn't try and impose my opinion on anyone else with that one. Stubble McShave sends in a tip and says, okay, so now we're doing limericks. Well, here's one. There once was a pundit named Rob who was really good at his job. When watching Picard, he found it quite hard not to break down and sob. Ooh, Stubble, that's pretty good. Bob, is your latest one going to be better than Stubble's? I don't know. Are people going to start hitting me with these things? I don't mind. As long as they're good. Dan V sends in a tip and says, have you read the interview from Polygon with Josh Trank discussing Fantastic Four? Yes. I do feel that movie was taken away from him, but the relationship with the writer was very antagonistic. Trank doesn't look in that section with the writer doing 18 drafts and 2,000 pages. Yeah, you know what? I've never met Josh Trank. I know John Schnepp liked Josh Trank, but I read that article and I was like, yeesh. Why were you so arrogant directing if you have an opportunity to direct a studio movie and you're coming off an indie film that's successful, I think you have to work within that structure, the studio system, and I think it'll be beneficial to you in the long run, because when you're working in the studio system, you're spending someone else's money, and they've already believed in you, so you've already been given the keys to that kingdom, and if you drive that car well, you could end up being very, very successful. But the attitude that he has, I think he would have changed his tune. There's a lot of people that, for whatever reason, they think if their movie becomes successful, that gives them carte blanche to be a douche or to throw around their weight. I've never understood that. I worked for a director that didn't direct. He'd made one low-budget indie feature. And I'll say his name. I mean, I've said before, his name was Robin Armstrong, who I greatly admired. I liked his Now he's like a voiceover coach. But I really liked his first film, Pastime, and I met him when I was working on Free Willy. And he was directing Free Willy. And 6 weeks before Free Willy was going to get made, and by the way, for anyone who's seen Free Willy, I know everyone from the UK is laughing, but Free Willy, the Orca movie with Keiko, starring Keiko the killer whale, I was the producer's assistant on that. And Robin Armstrong, 6 weeks before the movie was going to get made, before production began, he quit. He straight up and quit. And he felt the script wasn't up to snuff. And Simon Windsor, of course, Simon Windsor, an old pro, stepped in and took over and did a fine job with Free Willy. I went to work for Robin Armstrong, and over the course of the time that I was working for him, he was offered other studio movies. Mighty Ducks, Cool Runnings, and I was his director of development, and I was hoping that he would take one of these films, so I would then go, and this was the early 90s. So I was young, I was mid-20s, and I thought, okay, I'm going to get in with a director. I mean, he had me set up meetings where we would meet with screenwriters and then set up screenings of Pastime and talk about what we wanted. And then I found what I thought was a great script by a woman named Constance Burge, who wrote a script called Turn and Burn about these waitresses at a diner in Hollywood. This was long before the movie Waitress. And what did Connie Burge go do? Well, she went on and created Charmed. But anyway, he could have done any of these movies, and he didn't do it. He didn't do it. He was always looking for the perfect script, and I worked for him for like a year until one day he called me his assistant, and I literally walked out. I'd had enough. But, when you're given an opportunity to direct a studio movie, you take that opportunity for what it's worth. You gotta make that film. You have to be strong and stand up for it, but you also have to be a team player. You're working within a certain studio system, the confines of which everybody wants to get into. And when I read that article, I'm like, boy, no wonder, dude. I mean, I wish him the best. And he's got the new movie out with Tom Hardy about Al Capone, later in life. I hope that the movie's good. I've heard the performances are good. And a friend of mine, Zach Stentz, who co-wrote Cody Banks, he said some nice things about, Ashley and Zach had written they'd written a Fantastic Four versus X-Men script that was really, really good, but it hasn't ever been made. And it was interesting seeing him go back on Twitter, but I read what he was saying, and I'm like, man, somebody should have coached him. But it bothered me. It bummed me out. Dan goes on to say, Skater, the writer, said that the Avengers should be the template, and Trank hated that movie. Trank's defense was that Slater's tone of the film was something he didn't have anything in common with, where Trank didn't care as much about the team having powers. Yeah, when I read that article, I was like, I understand you made your cool indie superhero movie like Chronicle, but if you're going to go now make a Fantastic Four movie, you've got to go make the Fantastic Four movie. And I read these what he was saying, and I'm like, no wonder what happened. I have to say, after reading that interview, I got to blame Trank for that one. That was all on him. It was all on him. He chose to have the relationships that he had with people. He chose to do what he did on that film, and unfortunately everybody suffered for it. Her Robert Koal says, R.I.P. Florian Schneider. Yes, for those of you who don't know, Florian Schneider, one of the founders of Kraftwerk. Now, I don't know if Dieter Bastian is a Kraftwerk fan. He might only like metal. But Kraftwerk was a hugely influential band for me. I loved electronic music. I still do. And I loved Kraftwerk's material. And Florian Schneider died, I think he was 17. He was 72. He wasn't 17. R.I.P. Florian Schneider. I recommend Kraftwerk and the Electronic Revolution, a 3-hour documentary about the experimental avant-garde 60s and 70s krautrock scene and the groundbreaking music act it spawned. It's free on YouTube. Oh, I've seen that documentary. I didn't know it was free on YouTube. I was actually thinking about that earlier today. Let me put this in the live chat. Here, in fact, is the link to the YouTube documentary about krautrock. And it's very sad that we lost him today. Dan V goes on and says, then Slater said Trank wouldn't let him meet with Fox without him, where he left after 6 months while seemingly Trank didn't care about the comics. I honestly don't understand why Trank took the job if he cared about little about the characters and lore. Here is the article, by the way, and it is lengthy. The Slater section doesn't make Trank come across well with not caring about Galactus, Annihilus, and so on. Yeah, I think everybody should read this article. I found this article really interesting. Now, I don't know Josh Trank, and I don't want to bag on him. And he's got a movie out, and I'm like, thank God he snapped back and was able to make another movie, because I really liked Chronicle a lot. So here's the article when Josh Trank is talking about Chronicle, and it's an interesting read. But yeah, you read it and you're like, wow, he really blew what I thought was a great opportunity to make a great movie, and not caring about these things. I agree. Look, when you take on a studio movie, what you want to do is you want to show, here's a pro tip for anybody that might get lucky to work in the studio system. If you get a job working on a studio movie, directing a studio movie, you are being judged by the entire establishment of Hollywood in how you handle a studio film. There are very few people. At any one time, there's probably 20 people in the world. Actually, there's about 5 people in the world, but they'll settle for 20. That a studio wants to helm their picture. Not that many. And that list is always changing. And if you do something within the studio system and people have a good time with you, the movie comes out. Even if the movie turns out to not be a huge success, if the film is well regarded, it's recognized as being a good piece of work, you still don't necessarily have to go to director jail. But it really depends. I mean, yeah, obviously they want you to make money. But when you're making a studio movie, you're not just proving yourself with the studio you're working for, you're proving yourself to the entire industry. And it's probably a good bet that you try and make the best movie you possibly can. At least that's what I would say. Rick Berg sends in a super chat and says, Captain Kirk once said, where do you from up? Point being, one can't every time be great. 15 minutes is all that we are allowed. Where do you from up? I don't know. I don't remember that. I don't know where you're coming from. But I do agree with you. You can't be great every time, and 15 minutes is all you're allowed. In Hollywood, people seldom get second acts in Hollywood, so you might as well take what you can, when you can, how you can. You know, you got to take it very seriously and do your best. Anonymous sends in a tip and says, if AMC Disney Springs in Orlando showed the movie Splash, would they censor Daryl Hannah's butt? For those of you who haven't heard about that controversy, everyone who knows in Splash, when Daryl Hannah runs back off into the sea, you see her gorgeous backside. And on the version they're showing on Disney Plus, they have censored that with a ridiculous, I don't know what it's supposed to be, like her hair or something, this weird CG covering of her butt. And once again, the infantilization of children. What, we can't handle seeing human beings bare ass in a non-sexual context? I mean, she is a mermaid. I mean, there's a lot of questions about mermaids. What happens when their legs fuse together or when they come out of the water? How does that all work? Very strange, but yes, it's a weird. The whole thing is weird, but what can you do? But that's very funny. I think they would show the original version. Well, look at that. There's another letter for whining about movies tonight. There's 2. All right, we got 2. This one comes from Artillo Montanez. Hey, man, I love your work. This is not a question, but just a heads up on a video with Sam Hargrave breaking down that 12-minute scene in Extraction. Ooh, I haven't seen this, which I think you would love. Thanks for the entertainment, brother. Well, everyone knows it's like a 12-minute fight scene. That's pretty show-stopping. I didn't know that they made a video, but in case you didn't know about this, here is the link in the live chat to check out this video. I'm going to check out this video right after the show is over. So that's very cool. Thanks for writing me and bringing that to my attention, because I did not know that. Dean Mikatich, who I think is gone, writes in a letter that I like this. Dean Mikatich in the UK says, "Hi, Rob and the Post-Geek Singularity. On Friday, it will be the 75th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe. Here in the UK, there will be a lot of planned events to mark the occasion, but alas, due to the current crisis, most of those plans have been scrapped due to the lockdown. Personally, to mark the occasion, I will be sitting down to watch one of the greatest miniseries and probably the greatest World War II miniseries, Band of Brothers. 10 hours packed with high drama and action, all based on true stories of the men from Easy Company of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division. I remember you mentioning some time ago that Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks are working on their third World War II miniseries after Band of Brothers in the Pacific, a show I found extremely hard to get into. This show would be based around pilots. At the time, I was hoping that they would base these stories not just on the U.S. Army Air Wing, but the Royal Air Force as well. Not because I'm British, but because before America joined the war, the RAF had solely gone up against the mighty Luftwaffe and won the battle for the air over England and the English Channel, putting a major dent into Hitler's plans to invade the UK. But there's also another reason I wanted this show to be based on the RAF. During this time, it was not just British and Commonwealth countries British Commonwealth countries who had men and women making up the RAF, but also airmen and personnel that had fled mainland Europe and had joined up to continue the fight after their own countries had been invaded. Even some Americans had come over to fight as they disagreed with their own country refusing to enter the war and help save Europe. Maybe they'll cover that. I'm not sure. Given that this is an American production, I was not surprised to learn the show would be based solely around American airmen, or more specifically, the 8th Air Force, and based on the book Masters of the Air, America's Bomber Boys Who Fought the Air War Against Nazi Germany by Donald L. Miller. The show was originally developed by HBO, but they dropped it, and Apple Plus has now picked it up. I didn't know that. Let's hope this show will be as enjoyable as Band of Brothers is. So, Rob, with this occasion, what classic World War II film or TV show will you watch to mark the occasion? Well, you know me. My favorite TV miniseries about World War II, I love Band of Brothers, but I love The Winds of War. I love it. I own it. I can't get enough of it. The Winds of War is a Dan Curtis who created like Dark Shadows, directed it, and it's this sprawling miniseries. There was a sequel made, War and Remembrance, that's even longer, and it's still really good, but there's just something about The Winds of War that's about the lead up to World War II that I really, 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 really like. And you know what? Always a good time, always a good excuse to dip back in to that because I can't get enough. I can't get enough of The Winds of War. This next letter comes from Holly Hudson, and I think she just entered the contest for the JBL Bar 9.1. She says, I enjoy your content. Thank you. Well, thank you, Holly. I very much appreciate you taking the time to write in. That was very nice of you. And speaking of letters, let's see. I've got another Ian Samuels letter. Ian Samuels, like Omar, you guys are writing me every single day. Rob and fellow Robservationists. For fans of Clive Barker's Hellraiser, this could be a time of excitement or a time to prepare for even more disappointment. Hellraiser began as a novella called That Hellbound Heart by English horror great Clive Barker, first published in 1986. It was developed into a screenplay the following year. Hellraiser the movie was made in 1987 with a small budget of around an estimated $1 million, and it went on to make more than $14.5 million worldwide in box office takings, and more once it went to VHS. The cast included Andrew Robinson, who would go on to play Garrick in Deep Space Nine, and there's a reason I mention that. Due to its success, a sequel was soon in production, and Hellbound Hellraiser 2 was released in '88. The budget was increased to $3 million. It didn't make as much as the first, but it did make $12 million. After a short break, the $5 million budgeted Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth hit the screens in 1992, again made in the region of $12 to $12.5 million. The cast included a certain Terry Farrell, who would go on to play Jadzia Dax in Deep Space Nine, along with Andrew Robinson's Garrick. The Hellraiser franchise would return in 1996 with Hellraiser Bloodlines, an odd combination of sci-fi and historical horror drama Telling the tale of l'Immersion, the toy maker tasked with building the first Lament configuration box. His descendant we find in the future on a space station of his own design, designed as a trap for Pinhead and his Cenobites. With a $4 million budget, it only made a little over $9 million. Also, it had a very troubled production, unfortunately. This should have been taken as a sign that the Hellraiser franchise was done, and may have been done after the third film. Some may argue that it should have been left at 2, or even just the first standalone film. I like Hellraiser 2 a lot. No one listened, and in 2000 we got Hellraiser Inferno, 2002's Hellraiser Hellseeker, and in 2005 Deader and Hellworld, all straight-to-video efforts. Before the ultimate nail in the coffin, a 2011 reimagining called Hellraiser Revelations, the first not to have the titular Doug Bradley as Pinhead. Bradley revealed in an interview with the Horror Channel that he had never been asked. He didn't even know there was going to be another Hellraiser movie until a friend asked him if he was in it after he didn't go to the premiere. Bradley told this friend, "Well, no one told me they were making another one." It has been announced recently that not only is there going to be yet another reimagining movie, but also a TV series. So the question remains, considering what has happened to the franchise over the years, and particularly with the awful 2011 Revelations. Actually, a friend of mine made that movie, so I was excited that they got work. Should we be excited for a new film and TV series, or should lovers of the franchise just prepare themselves for further disappointment? Ian. Good letter, Ian. I'm a huge Hellraiser fan. Marvel Comics, well, Epic Comics, the Epic Comics line put out a long-running Hellraiser comic series, and I think the idea behind Hellraiser is great. I mean, I love the idea of a Hellraiser series. I think as an anthology series, you could go to a lot of different places with it. I mean, remember, what I love about Hellraiser is it's not necessarily about demons from hell coming up and causing a problem. It's about human beings that are seeking out those demons. The Cenobites only come when called. If you open up the Lament configuration, then you summon them. You like Frank Cotton in Hellraiser. That was all him. He was bored with the pleasures that the pleasures of the flesh that he could find on Earth were not enough, and he wanted to feel what it was like to have his soul torn apart, and he certainly did. And I think as long as you're dealing with human folly and you're wrapping those stories around the Cenobites in some way, shape, or form, I think you can come up with something great. And I'll tell you one thing, I'll bet Doug Bradley could still probably play. Let's see how old Doug Bradley is. I mean, Stallone could be in a Demolition Man movie. Pinhead. Actor. Let's see. So Doug Bradley is, in fact... Oh, he was born September 7th, 1954. And while, he's 65, he can totally still play Pinhead. Put makeup on that guy's face, totally. Doug Bradley should be Hellraiser. He should still be... He's actually... The hell that you raise is Doug Bradley. So I'm all in. I think that you absolutely should... They should bring him back. Factual Opinion sends in a tip and says, I despise the Ferengi and the Next Generation in Enterprise, so imagine to my surprise that I'm actually enjoying Quark from Deep Space Nine. Factual Opinion, I think they do a great job with the Ferengi in Deep Space Nine. Quark, Rom, Nog, and the Grand Nagus, Wallace Shawn, Moogie. I really love the Ferengi in Deep Space Nine. Sometimes the episodes got a little tiresome, but for the most part, I thought... Not a bad group there. So I'm glad, Factual Opinion, you're digging it. The Richard sends in a super chat and says, right after your show, the Post-Geek Singularity Facebook watch party will play the extended unrated Life Force for those who have not seen it. Oh, good for you, the Richard. Yes, the Richard, you can find him on the Post-Geek Singularity Facebook page. Also the Whining About Movies Facebook page. Go look him up. And, yeah. Oh, Rick Berg sends in, that was Where Do You Go From Up, Ultimate Computer, the original series. I apologize. Well, Rick, I remember that now. Yes, sir, you are correct. That's a good question. Always one to be asked. So, yes. Dan sends in another tip. Dan V says, I agree with you, Rob. That Trank interview made me believe that the movie was doomed. Pardon the pun. Long before Fox executives got involved. There's just a certain way you should treat people and not be so high and mighty with throwing your weight around. Look, I understand when you made a movie making a movie is so hard that when you finish a film that is then well received, and as far as the depiction of superheroes and people flying and all that, there's a reason why that movie, I mean, Josh Trank did a great job with Chronicle, but you know what? Hollywood doesn't care anymore. You made money for them once, they'll look at what you're doing now, but you're judged on every one of your projects as you move forward. It doesn't matter what you did in the past. And you can't, if you're working on a studio movie, working on a studio movie is the ultimate. If you get there, it's a gift, and you should take it seriously, and you should make it the best thing it can be. Anonymous sends in a tip and says, hey, Rob, imagine you are so excited to go see a movie and the theaters are open, but they're playing bad movies like Catwoman, Battlefield Earth, Howard the Duck, and The Room. Would you go anyways just to see them? Huh. If I already knew they were bad, probably not. But right now I'm so desperate to go to a movie theater and just have the experience of sitting in a chair and seeing trailers and feeling that anticipation. But I don't like to go to movie theaters and see bad movies. I know how hard movies are to make, and whenever I see a bad film, I mean, I appreciate whenever anybody gets a movie done, but it bums me out. It bums me out. Regis K sends in a tip. Hey, Rob, one TV series I really liked when I was a teenager is The Champions, about a team of superpowered spies featuring one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen, Alexandra Bastido. The Champions. I didn't watch The Champions, but let's look her up. I'm going to look up her because I don't know. Let's see. Oh, you're talking about the British. I thought it was some new show. Yeah, the Champions. Okay. It is The Champions. You're talking about The Champions from the 60s. Yes. I am so with you right then and there. I don't know. I did not know that was her name. Yes, she is an incredibly beautiful woman, and she's got that exotic I'm from all over Europe thing going. I like The Champions show. I thought it was some superhero thing you're talking about. But yes, I like it too. The Champions is great. I have DVDs of it somewhere around here. I actually got DVDs of The Champions show at San Diego Comic-Con back in the 90s. Somebody was selling like bootleg versions of them. And that's what I have. I still have those. Oh, BL Alley is here with a limerick. Being the viceroy of verisimilitude requires a very good attitude. The Post-Geek Singularity comprises many a rarity, extending our heartfelt gratitude. Ooh, I like that. Being the viceroy of verisimilitude requires a very good attitude. The Post-Geek Singularity comprises many a rarity, extending our heartfelt gratitude. Well, I love that. That's fantastic, fellows. Yeah, now that I'm looking at Alexandra Bastido, yeah, there's wow. Like here, I'm going to just send you guys a link to this picture so you can all see what I'm talking about. Yeah, this is here. This is somebody's blog, but here you go. I'll put that in the live chat. Paste. There you go. Oh, she died of cancer in 2014, age 67. That's very sad. She was a vegetarian. And she was born in Sussex in 1946, the eldest child of a Canadian-born father who claimed Spanish, Dutch, Scottish, and Native American extraction, and a mother of Swiss, French, and Italian descent. See, I told you, who had been brought up in Czechoslovakia. I told you she had that. I've been all over. There you go. I've been all over Europe. Anonymous sends in a tip and says, will a movie like Logan be on Disney Plus or is it going to be on Hulu? It's not going to be on Disney Plus. At least not yet. I think ultimately that Disney Plus is probably going to have to stay family friendly for as long as possible, I would imagine. And then everything else will go to Hulu. But the thing is, Disney now has the entire Fox library, and most of their library of films are not rated G. I've noticed that some movies, like The Sound of Music, is in fact on Sound of Music is on Disney Plus, and I think it's PG actually. Maybe it's G. I'm not sure. Shaw sends in a tip and says, "I just can't wait for Rob to go see Fast 9, and the first scene is Shaw killing Han again." Boom, mic drop. You wish. You wish. They're not going to bring back Han only to have him die again. I can't believe you said that. Can't even believe you said that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this brings an end to Robservations episode number 408. We will be back here in 3.5 hours for Whining About Movies episode number, is it 24? 23, 24? We are going to be talking about Tobe Hooper's 1985 opus, Life Force, released by Cannon Films, which, by the way, features Patrick Stewart's first on-screen kiss. That's right, Jean-Luc Picard's first on-screen kiss occurs in Life Force, and he kisses Steve Railsback, star of a previous film on Elizaviews, The Stuntman. So, Whining About Movies tonight at 8 o'clock, watching Life Force. And after the show, you can go watch the international version of Life Force on the Post-Geek Singularity webpage on Facebook, if you would like to do that. So I want to thank everybody who participated in today's show. Thank you for sending me letters. Thanks for supporting the channel as I meant to hit the other camera and go out on this camera. I want to thank everybody for supporting the channel. Thank everybody for being a part of this. And I am thinking about having a Zoom birthday party where I'm just going to hang out. I'll get like 300 people can come in and we can all drink. You know, you don't have to, no super chats or tips or anything like that. We'll just hang out. Elizabeth and I will be here. We'll hang out. I'm looking into doing that. A Zoom birthday party. I've never had a Zoom birthday party. My birthday is Friday, May 15th. It's a week from Friday. So that should be exciting. I'm still going to do a show that day, but afterwards we will have some kind of a wacky, fun time. I want to thank my moderating staff. I want to thank Mike Bodden. I want to thank Detective Jim Boyers and his wife Heidi. I want to thank Louis Yu. I want to thank Jordy Lyons. I want to thank Greg Smith. And I want to thank the Richard for all being you guys. And tonight, Elizabeth's Whining About Movies, Life Force. And remember, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And with that, I would say have a better rest of your afternoon, because I'll see you tonight. Join us. Elizabeth's Whining About Movies should be pretty rockin' tonight. Elizabeth wanted to see a really strange, weird movie after The Elephant Man. I'd say this is more pulpy fun. I don't think it's strange and weird, but I think it's fun, and it certainly will be fun to hear her opinion of it. So I look forward to seeing you guys tonight. And as always, have a better day.